Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Inside the embassy compound in Basra, the air felt too thick to breathe. Diesel fumes, sweat, and static mixed in a suffocating haze. Radios hissed and cracked with broken transmissions, each burst of noise carrying another reminder that time was bleeding away. Beyond the walls, faint gunfire echoed like thunder from another world, a world closing in. 200 hostages were trapped just blocks away, bound and terrified inside a school now turned into a fortress. Every minute they waited was a minute closer to death. Commanders shouted over one another, voices sharp, desperate. A storm of maps, coffee cups, and conflicting orders littered the table. Arguments folded into chaos, men pounding fists, trying to sound certain when no one really was. Every officer wore the same look, a mask of control hiding fear. And then there was her. Captain Emily Hayes stood off to the side, helmet dangling from one hand, her flight suit streaked with oil stains and dust. She looked like someone out of place, too calm, too quiet. She wasn't on anyone's list of solutions. She wasn't even supposed to be in the room. Just another transport pilot, useful for supply runs, not rescues, not heroics. But when the shouting stopped for just a second, one heartbeat of silence, her voice broke through the noise. "Let me fly them out." Heads turned. The colonel at the center of the storm looked up slowly, his expression hovering somewhere between disbelief and irritation. "What did you say?" Her tone didn't waver. "I can get a team in, and the hostages out." For a moment no one spoke. Then someone laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. Another joined in, low and mocking. "She's a cargo pilot," one officer said under his breath. "She ferries crates, not soldiers." A few chuckled, the kind of laughter that bites. The colonel didn't even bother hiding his smirk. "Last thing I need is a woman crashing in downtown Basra," he said. "Stick to supply runs, Captain." The words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. She'd heard versions of that line her entire career. Too quiet, too soft, too cautious. She looked at the map again, tracing her finger over the rooftops, the alleys, the hidden path along the river. She saw it clearly, the narrow stretch of concrete half buried under rubble. To most, it was nothing. To a pilot like her, it was a landing strip. Tight, dangerous, possible. She opened her mouth again. "If we insert from above and exfil here, we can get them out before dawn." This time no one even bothered to respond. The colonel turned away. A young captain muttered, "Cargo Queen thinks she's a gunfighter now." She said nothing. Her eyes lowered to the map again, because she wasn't thinking about pride. She wasn't thinking about proving herself. She was thinking about the people in that school gym, their wrists tied, their eyes covered, and about one face she would never see again. Jordan. The name alone brought a pulse of memory so sharp it almost hurt. Years ago, another hostage mission. Another night. Another pilot. He'd volunteered when no one else would. She had watched him leave that night, and she had watched the sunrise without him. Kandahar. It still echoed in her chest like a wound that never healed. "If no one else steps up, you do," he had told her once. She never forgot. Now standing in that stifling tent, surrounded by the same noise, the same fear, the same hesitation, she could feel it happening again. Men talking in circles while lives ticked away. She could almost hear his voice in her head. So she didn't move, she didn't back down. "You breach that building on foot," she said quietly, "and you'll lose half your men before the first classroom." The colonel didn't look up. "You're dismissed, Captain." Her throat tightened, but she didn't move. The radios kept screaming, the air thick with tension, the clock on the wall hammering toward dawn. Outside, the city burned faintly red on the horizon. Inside, 100 decisions were collapsing under fear. And yet she stayed, because she already knew what she had to do. Hours dragged like years. The arguments didn't stop. The commanders bickered, red-faced and exhausted, while the air in the tent grew heavier with every passing minute. Emily sat on a folding chair in the corner, helmet resting on her knee. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. She looked calm, too calm, and that unsettled people. A few officers glanced her way, uneasy. Maybe they saw what they thought was indifference. It was. It was control. Inside, she was a storm. Calculations, memories, the sound of Jordan's voice looping in her head. If no one else steps up, you do. In her flight locker across the compound sat an old patch, a winged dagger embroidered in faded thread. Most people wouldn't know what it meant. The few who did wouldn't ask. But it was real, and so was everything that came with it. Emily Hayes wasn't just a transport pilot. She was something else, something the personnel files never said. When the radio operator struggled with an intercepted broadcast, she leaned over and quietly said 3 words in Pashto. The man blinked, startled. "You speak that." She didn't answer, just slipped the headset back into his hand and walked away. Cargo pilots didn't pick up languages like that on accident. By midnight, the situation worsened. A garbled voice came through the static on the terrorist frequency, cold and measured. At dawn, executions will begin, 1 every 10 minutes. The words hit like gunfire. The officers in the tent froze, their arguments dying instantly. The colonel clenched his jaw. A few cursed under their breath. One of the younger pilots looked away, pale. Emily didn't move, didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes for half a second, her mind racing through the math. Distances, wind speeds, flight times, landing clearances. She could see the mission already, every turn, every shadow. Someone whispered, "We can't risk it, we wait, we negotiate." Negotiate with men who'd already decided to start killing. She didn't need to answer that. The silence around her said it all. The clock kept ticking. Just after 2:00 a.m., the embassy walls shook. Gunfire ripped through the night, short, violent bursts that sent the entire compound scrambling. Shouts cut through the dark. "Contact, north perimeter." Emily was outside near the hangar when the first round snapped past. She dropped behind a concrete barrier, pressing her shoulder to the wall. Tracer rounds sliced across the courtyard, lighting the dust red. A soldier sprinting nearby suddenly crumpled, a scream tearing from his throat. He hit the ground hard, clutching his leg. Blood was already spreading across the gravel. No one moved. For a moment the chaos froze everyone. Confusion, hesitation, fear. Emily didn't hesitate. She ran. Bullets cracked overhead, slamming into walls as she dove beside him, hands already working. "Hold still," she said, her voice calm, precise. She tore a strip from her sleeve, looped it around his thigh, tightened until the bleeding slowed. Her fingers moved fast, automatic. The soldier's breathing steadied. The panic drained from his eyes. Nearby, a Navy SEAL crouched behind cover, firing bursts into the dark, but his eyes flicked toward her. He saw how she moved, how sure she was, how unshaken. Since when did cargo pilots know combat medicine? She didn't answer, didn't even look up. When the medic arrived, she stepped back quietly, checking once more that the bleeding had stopped before picking up her helmet. The gunfire faded. The compound fell back into silence, but the silence was different now. People were looking at her, not mocking, not laughing, just wondering. Who was she really? She didn't notice. Or maybe she pretended not to. She just walked back toward the hangar, the gravel crunching under her boots. Later, when the chaos settled and the colonel ordered another round of briefings, she stood in the back as they argued flight paths. Lieutenant Harper was sketching on the map, mumbling wind speeds. 15 knots from the southeast, he said. Adjust 5 degrees and you'll clear. It's 17, Emily interrupted softly. He turned startled. What? 17, gusting to 21. She stepped closer, pencil in hand, marking a new line. If you approach at 5 degrees, you'll drift left straight into their firing line. You need 7, minimum. The tent went quiet again. Harper blinked, recalculated, then looked up at her. She was right, completely. The SEAL commander, standing in the corner, watched the exchange closely. His eyes narrowed, recognition flickering behind them. But he didn't speak, not yet. Emily just set the pencil down and stepped back. "If you want them alive," she said, "you fly it that way." Then she turned and walked out. The silence she left behind wasn't mocking this time. It was heavy, uneasy. Because maybe, just maybe, she wasn't who they thought she was. And as dawn crept closer, the city beyond the walls burned faint orange. The terrorists' promise still hung in the air like a knife. Executions would begin at sunrise. Inside the compound, every man waited for someone else to make the call. But Emily Hayes didn't wait for orders anymore. Not after Kandahar. Not after Jordan. Because if no one else stepped up, she would. Why did the SEAL commander go silent when he heard her call sign? The morning sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, but the light over Basra was already bruised and angry, ash and gold mixing above the rooftops. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of burned coffee and sweat-soaked uniforms. No one had slept. Not really. The last hour before dawn always carried a different kind of fear, the kind that whispers instead of shouts. Radios hissed. Fingers drummed nervously on the edge of the map table. The colonel's voice was low but urgent, chasing new plans in circles. Then the heavy flap of the tent opened. A tall man stepped inside, his body armor smeared with the grime of a long night, his eyes sharp beneath the shadow of his helmet. Every head turned. You didn't need to be told who he was. The presence alone said enough. The SEAL commander. He walked straight to the table, scanning the maps, the commanders, the air of panic hanging like static. His voice came calm but edged. "What's the latest?" The colonel stiffened, briefing him quickly. Positions, threats, the terrorists' ultimatum. But halfway through, a low voice cut across the tent. "Cargo Queen thinks she can fly us in." It wasn't loud, just a muttered remark from one of the flight officers near the back, but the words carried. The commander's head turned instantly. His eyes landed on Emily. "Say that again," he said quietly. The room froze. The young pilot shifted uncomfortably, realizing too late that he'd just made a mistake. It's just her, sir. Captain Hayes," she was suggesting. The commander's gaze snapped back to Emily. His tone hardened. "Did you just say Raven?" The sound of her call sign cut through the air like a blade. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her helmet was under her arm, her posture straight, her eyes calm. For a second, nothing happened. Then something in the commander's face changed. Recognition, disbelief, and something close to respect. "By God," he muttered almost to himself. Then louder, "By God, that's Captain Hayes." He turned to the room, voice rising. "Stand down or stand with her." It was like a bomb had gone off. Only silence followed. The colonel's jaw went slack. The other pilots who had mocked her looked away, faces burning. Even the young SEALs in the corner straightened, a ripple of realization passing through the group. Emily didn't move, didn't flinch. The commander took a slow step closer, his voice steady but firm. "Some of you don't know me and most of you don't know her, but I was there. Kandahar, night op, joint extraction. 40 men trapped behind the line. They said it was impossible." He looked around the room, his eyes landing on each officer in turn. Then she came out of the dark, alone, under fire that tore the sky apart. She flew in through a corridor no sane pilot would have tried, and she got us home, all of us. Without her, I'd be a name on a wall right now. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. No one spoke. The colonel's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The other officers stared at the floor. Emily said nothing. She didn't bask in the recognition. She didn't even look at them. She just adjusted the strap of her helmet and waited. Finally, the commander's voice cut through again, calm but final. If she says she can fly this mission, you clear the sky for her." Engines roared to life outside the compound. Dust and sunlight collided as the first Black Hawks powered up, their rotors tearing through the air. Emily stood in front of her crew, flight gloves on, headset clipped, every movement precise, methodical. She didn't shout her orders. She didn't need to. Her calm carried more authority than any barked command. "Formation will run low and tight," she said over the comms. "Rooftop insert, quick breach, extraction through the south corridor. We move fast, we move clean, we don't leave anyone behind." The SEAL commander gave a nod from beside her, helmet on, rifle slung across his chest. "You get us in," he said. "We'll get them out." She gave a small, tight smile. "You'd better." The turbines screamed higher, shaking the ground beneath their boots. Sunlight caught the dust, turning the air golden. And then they lifted. 4 birds rising together, rotors carving through smoke and sky. The noise was deafening, the power bone-deep. Emily's helicopter led the formation, her fingers light on the cyclic, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Raven to all, hold altitude 40 feet, she said. "Follow my line exactly, no deviations." Acknowledgments crackled back through the comms. Basra unfolded beneath them, a maze of rooftops, alleys, and smoke plumes. The city was waking, but not peacefully. Fires still burned from the night's clashes, and somewhere below, the school compound waited like a trap set in stone. Gunfire started before they even crossed the river. Small bursts, erratic but close. Muzzles flashed from rooftops, and the smell of cordite filled the cockpit. "Contact left 2 rooftops," the gunner shouted. Emily banked hard, low, weaving between buildings. The other birds followed, hugging her trail like shadows. Sparks scattered as rounds pinged off reinforced armor. "Stay on me," she called, voice steady despite the chaos. "Do not break formation." The SEAL commander's voice came through her headset, low and even. "Reminds you of Kandahar, doesn't it?" She smiled faintly without taking her eyes off the horizon. "I was hoping you wouldn't bring that up." "Couldn't forget it if I tried," he replied. "Let's make this one count." "Copy that." They came on the school compound fast. From above, it looked like a block of stone surrounded by walls and desperation. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, snipers on the roof. The gym windows were dark, but shadows moved behind them. "Approach vector in 10, Emily said. "Birds 2 and 3 stand by for rooftop drop. Bird 4 hold over watch." The radio hissed with affirmatives. Wind shear hit them as they descended. Her hands moved in perfect rhythm, small corrections, instinctive adjustments. Her crew chief called out altitudes, his voice tight with focus. 30 feet. 20. Contact clear ropes. Ropes dropped like lightning. SEALs slid down into chaos, boots hitting rooftops, guns ready. Within seconds, the first shots rang out below, short bursts, controlled, precise. Emily's eyes flicked to her right. Bird 2 was coming in behind her, just meters off. Then the warning light flashed red. "RPG gym window." Her head snapped left. A smoke trail hissed toward them, splitting the dawn. "Break right, Bird 2, she shouted. The explosion hit almost instantly. The shockwave slammed her cockpit, the sound shattering in her chest. Bird 2 spun, tail smoking, rotor screaming. "Mayday, mayday, we're hit." "Hold on," she said through gritted teeth. "You're not going down." Without thinking, she dropped her own bird underneath them, matching their descent, using her rotor wash to stabilize their spin. Warning lights flared red across her dash. Metal whined. "Ease your yaw just a little," she said, voice steady as stone. "I've got you." It worked. Slowly, impossibly, the crippled helicopter leveled. Bird 2 climbed again, smoke trailing behind but steady. Her co-pilot stared at her wide-eyed. "Ma'am, we took rounds through the tail." "I know," she said. "We'll deal with it later." The SEAL commander's voice broke in. "Extraction zone clear. We're moving hostages now." "Copy that," she replied. She brought her helicopter down into the courtyard. Rotor wash blasted debris across the ground. Her voice stayed calm on the comms. "Bird 2, land rear. Bird 3, hold overhead, cover windows." The first hostages stumbled out, a flood of terrified faces, hands bound, eyes wide. SEALs shouted, herding them toward the birds. Children, teachers, foreign workers, all moving in a frantic, chaotic stream. Emily's hand stayed locked on the controls, keeping the bird steady as more civilians poured in. "Load fast," she said over the radio. "We're wheels up in 90 seconds." 90 seconds. That was all the time she gave them. Gunfire ripped from the rooftops. Bullets snapped against her armor. One cracked the windshield, spiderwebbing glass. She didn't flinch. "Bird 2 status." "We're full." "Copy, wheels up." One by one, the helicopters lifted off, heavy with lives. Her own bird was last. The cargo bay was crammed. Men, women, children clutching each other, faces streaked with tears and dust. She took a deep breath. "Raven to all, we're clear, heading home." The city fell away beneath them. When they touched down back at the embassy compound, the world seemed to exhale. The rotor slowed. The engines whined down. For a moment no one moved. Then the rescued hostages began to spill out, stumbling, crying, some collapsing in relief. And the soldiers, those who had mocked her, doubted her, stood frozen, watching her climb down from the cockpit. Her flight suit was blackened with soot, her face streaked with sweat and grit, her expression calm, unreadable. The SEAL commander stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel. He stopped in front of her, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a salute. The men around him followed, one by one, a ripple of quiet respect spreading through the compound. Emily returned the salute slowly, her eyes steady, her voice silent. She didn't need to say anything. The act spoke for itself. Because courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just flies straight through fire and lands anyway. Why did she walk away from the applause? The compound was chaos wrapped in relief. The sky above Basra had turned pale gold, a quiet dawn breaking through drifting smoke. Helicopters squatted on the landing pads like exhausted beasts, their rotors slowing to a heavy rhythmic sigh. Every corner of the courtyard was alive, medics shouting for stretchers, soldiers hugging strangers, hostages crying against the shoulders of people they had never met. Emily stood in the middle of it all, untouched by the noise. Her gloves were still on, her helmet hanging loose at her side. The dust stuck to the sweat on her face, and streaks of soot marked the edges of her collar. She looked like someone carved out of the same steel as her aircraft, motionless, expression unreadable. Someone clapped, then another. The sound spread across the courtyard, building until even the wounded joined in. But she didn't move, didn't raise a hand, didn't smile. She only nodded once toward the crew chief who had been beside her since the first takeoff. He grinned, shaking his head. "You realize, ma'am, they're clapping for you." "Then they're wasting good energy," she said quietly. Her eyes were on the medics rushing a little boy toward the aid station. "Save that for the ones who earned it." The commander stepped up beside her, helmet still tucked under one arm. "You flew through hell," he said. "You earned it more than anyone." She didn't look at him. "I did my job, that's all." He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, the kind soldiers give when they know words won't change a thing. Around them, the celebration swelled. The colonel who had mocked her earlier stood off to the side, silent, his jaw tight. He didn't approach. Maybe shame kept him rooted where he was, maybe pride. Emily didn't care. Because while the others were cheering, her mind wasn't here. It was years away, in a desert that smelled of jet fuel and blood. Kandahar night, the kind of dark that swallowed sound. Jordan's laughter had echoed through the hangar that evening, low and rough. "You still thinking about applying for flight rotation?" he had teased, leaning against the wing of his bird. "You'd hate it. No sleep, bad food, no gratitude. She had smiled a small, quiet smile. Maybe, but someone's got to keep you alive. He had tossed her a set of keys. Then take my truck for the weekend. If I don't make it back, she's yours. She rolled her eyes, thinking it was a joke. It was. When the radio call came hours later, bird down, grid 721, she'd been the one to stand frozen at the hangar door, waiting for the confirmation that never came. They'd told her no survivors, no remains to recover, just fire. And now, standing in Basra years later, she could still feel that same fire in her chest. Only this time, she had stopped it from taking anyone else. She walked away from the noise, past the hangars, past the rows of grounded aircraft gleaming under the new sun. The wind carried the smell of oil and burned sand. She sat down on an empty ammo crate, elbows on her knees, eyes half closed. Her gloves came off slowly, one at a time, fingers stiff from hours on the stick. On her wrist, beneath a thin layer of dust, the tattoo glimmered faintly, wings above an anchor. She ran her thumb across it, feeling the ridges of the ink. For a moment, the sound of the crowd behind her faded, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of rotor blades in her memory. The commander found her there. He didn't speak right away. He just stood nearby, watching the way she looked out across the tarmac, as if she was seeing something no one else could. Finally, he said, "You ever going to tell them?" She didn't turn. Tell them what? That the patch in your locker isn't decoration. Her lips curved faintly, somewhere between amusement and regret. They wouldn't believe it even if I did. He chuckled softly. They do now. She looked up at him then, eyes tired but steady. Belief fades faster than fear. He studied her for a moment longer, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. The kind carried too long, edges worn. He handed it to her. A group shot, Kandahar, the night team. She recognized half the faces. Jordan was in the middle, grinning like he always had. Found it in an old file back home, the commander said. Figured you want a copy. Her throat tightened. She traced a finger over Jordan's face. He told me once, she said quietly, that courage isn't about noise. It's about the silence that comes after you decide. The commander nodded. He was right. They stood in silence for a while, two veterans of different wars that somehow felt the same. Then he said, "They'll write reports about this. Medals, speeches. You ready for that?" "No." "Then what will you do?" She looked out at the horizon, where the city still smoldered under the new sun. "Same thing I've always done. Fly, quietly." Hours later, the formal debrief began inside the command tent. The colonel spoke in clipped tones, reading off mission logs, casualty reports, and flight times. Every number sounded hollow compared to what had really happened. Emily sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, saying little. When they asked how she'd maintained control under RPG fire, she shrugged. Training. When they pressed about her decision to fly under the damaged bird, she simply said, "It seemed necessary." Her calm frustrated them. They wanted something cinematic, something to write down and praise, but that wasn't how it worked. She'd seen too many people turned into stories. Stories fade. Lives don't. When the meeting ended, the colonel cleared his throat. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice was softer now. "Your performance was exemplary. Command will want your statement." She stood. "They can read the flight log. Everything's there." He hesitated. "You understand this will make you a symbol." She met his gaze. "Then make sure the symbol stands for something real." He didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. That evening, as the compound settled into uneasy quiet, she walked the perimeter alone. The rescued hostages were resting in the medical tents. The city outside was still on edge, gunfire echoing in the far distance. But for now, the base held peace. She stopped by her aircraft. The fuselage was pocked with bullet holes, the paint scorched near the tail. She rested a hand against the metal skin, feeling the cold seep into her palm. Her crew chief approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "We'll get her patched up by tomorrow," he said. "She'll fly again." Emily nodded. "She always does." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Ma'am, what you did out there, people won't forget." "Good," she said. "Maybe they'll remember how it felt to trust someone they didn't understand." He frowned slightly, not sure what she meant, but she was already walking away. Night came soft and slow. The compound lights flickered on, painting the sand pale white. Emily sat alone again on the same crate, the photograph still folded in her pocket. She could hear laughter from the mess hall, music from someone's speaker. Life returning. She thought about the boy who had almost died in the courtyard, the one she had dragged from the gravel with a makeshift tourniquet. She visited him earlier. He'd been groggy but alive. When he saw her, he'd whispered, "You're the one who stopped the bleeding." She'd smiled faintly, just did what anyone would do. He'd shaken his head. "No, ma'am, you didn't wait." That line stayed with her. You didn't wait. Because that was it, the quiet truth behind everything she'd done. The reason she'd spoken up when no one listened, the reason she'd flown through the fire, the reason she'd refused the applause. She didn't wait. Not for permission. Not for recognition. Not for someone braver to go first. And somewhere deep inside, she hoped Jordan would have been proud of that. The commander found her there again, hands folded, eyes on the horizon. "You know," he said softly, "you could teach a lot of people something about what courage really looks like." She smiled without turning. "They wouldn't hear it if I said it." "Then show them." "I already did." He chuckled. "Fair enough." He turned to leave, then paused. "You ever think about what drives you to keep doing this, after everything?" She thought for a long moment. The night wind tugged at her hair, carrying the faint hum of the generators. "It's not duty," she said finally. "It's debt. To the ones who didn't make it back, I can't pay it off, but I can make sure it matters." He nodded slowly. "That's as good a reason as any." Later, when the camp lights dimmed and the city noise faded, she pulled out the photograph again. The faces smiled back at her from years ago, frozen in time. She whispered something too soft for anyone to hear, a promise kept, a name carried forward. And in that silence, the story found its heartbeat. Because courage doesn't always end with the explosion, or the cheer, or the salute. Sometimes it ends in the quiet, a lone pilot sitting beside a battered aircraft, listening to the wind, remembering those who taught her what bravery really means. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did they call her a hero when all she felt was tired? Morning came too bright, too clean, the kind of sunlight that tried to bleach away the night before. The embassy compound buzzed again, this time not with gunfire or alarms, but with voices, cameras, and polished boots. They'd sent suits. Not soldiers, not the ones who bled or flew through fire. Suits. The men from command arrived with their clipboards, their neat uniforms, their safe smiles. They moved like they owned the air they breathed. To them, the mission was already a report, an entry on a timeline, something to file and dissect. Emily sat on the edge of a cot in the corner of the medical tent. Her flight suit still smelled of fuel and smoke. Her eyes were clear but hollow. The man across from her, a major with too many decorations and not enough dust on his boots, flipped through her file with the mechanical rhythm of someone checking boxes. "Captain Hayes," he said finally, glancing up. "Command," reviewing the footage and reports. 200 civilians rescued, 0 casualties. You understand how rare that is." She said nothing, just nodded once. He leaned forward. "You'll be recommended for a commendation, possibly the Distinguished Flying Cross. That's not an offer we make lightly." Her hands tightened slightly on her knees. "I didn't do it for medals." The major smiled like someone humoring a child. "Of course not, but stories like this, they serve a purpose. Morale, public image. You'll be the face of it. Her gaze lifted slowly. The face of what? He hesitated. Of courage under fire. She let the silence hang between them. Then she said quietly, "Courage isn't for cameras, Major. It's for people who don't have another choice." He looked uncomfortable, adjusting his pen. "Nevertheless, command has its needs. The footage will circulate. There'll be interviews, maybe a press brief." "I'm not doing interviews." He blinked. "I'm sorry." "I'm not doing them," she repeated. "You can tell command that." His lips pressed into a tight smile. "Captain, that's not a request." Her jaw tightened. She leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive, just enough for the air to shift. "You weren't there, Major. You didn't smell the smoke. You didn't hear the hostages screaming through the comms. You didn't see the rotor blades cut through gunfire while people prayed they'd live another 30 seconds. Don't make a story out of it. It wasn't a story." The Major's expression froze. He didn't answer, didn't need to. The truth in her voice left no space for argument. He cleared his throat and stood. "I'll relay your response to command." As he left, the flap of the tent swayed in the hot wind, and for a long moment she just sat there, listening to the distant hum of helicopters. Outside, the courtyard looked different in daylight. The hostages who could walk were gathered near the transport trucks, waiting for evacuation to the airfield. Some waved when they saw her, small smiles of gratitude through exhaustion. She waved back once, brief, almost shy, before turning away. The SEAL commander found her again near the flight line, where mechanics were patching bullet holes on her helicopter. The bird looked battered but alive, streaks of scorched paint, half-melted rotor tips, a body that had seen hell and flown through it anyway. "Hell of a machine," the commander said, stepping beside her. "She held together," Emily replied softly. "Barely." He studied her face. "You don't look too proud." "I'm not," she said. "Pride's what gets people killed." He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but without it, no one stands up when the room goes quiet." She glanced at him, a faint flicker of a smile crossing her lips. "I didn't stand up for pride. I did it because no one else would." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "That's why you scare them." She raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "People in charge. The ones who build careers out of speeches and protocols. You remind them that sometimes courage doesn't need permission." Her eyes softened. "That's a dangerous kind of courage. The only kind that matters." By afternoon, the suits were gone, but the whispers stayed. The colonel, the one who dismissed her, stopped her outside the mess hall. He looked older now, lines deeper under his eyes. "Captain Hayes," he began stiffly, "I owe you an apology." "You don't." He exhaled. "I dismissed you, I misjudged you, I was wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. "You weren't wrong about me," she said quietly. "You just didn't look long enough." He swallowed, nodded once and walked away. That was enough. She didn't need more. Night came again, but this time there was peace in the compound. Real peace. No gunfire, no alarms. Just the wind moving softly over the tents and the low hum of generators. Emily walked alone down the runway, helmet under her arm. The city's glow flickered in the distance. Orange lights like the heartbeat of something still wounded, still waiting to heal. She stopped halfway down the tarmac, the night air cool against her face, and looked up at the stars. For a moment, she let herself breathe. No noise, no orders, no expectations, just the silence she'd earned. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the small dockyard town where she'd grown up. Her father's hands blackened by metal and salt. Her mother falling asleep over lesson plans. The nights she'd watched planes blink across the sky and wondered what it felt like to chase something that never stayed still. She smiled faintly. "Guess I found out," she murmured to the dark. Behind her, the sound of boots approached. "Couldn't sleep?" the commander asked, stopping a few feet away. "Didn't try." He nodded, me neither. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched comfortably between them, the kind of quiet that only people who have survived something together can share. Then he said softly, "You know, they'll never really understand what you did. I don't need them to. Still, 200 people are alive because of you." Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "They're alive because of all of us, the pilots, the crew chiefs, the SEALs, you. I just did my part." He shook his head. "You did more than that. You gave them a chance when everyone else was arguing over maps." She didn't answer, just kept her gaze fixed on the night sky. Finally he said, "What'll you do now?" She smiled faintly. "Same thing I did yesterday. Fly, keep quiet, let the noise belong to someone else." He looked at her with a small smile. "You think you can hide forever?" She turned to him. "I'm not hiding, I'm just not performing." He nodded slowly, understanding. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal tag, bent, scorched around the edges. He placed it gently in her hand. "Found it during the cleanup at the school," he said. The name was faded but visible enough. Jordan Price. Her breath caught. The world seemed to tilt for just a second. She ran her thumb over the letters, the edges biting into her skin. "He was there," she whispered. "Old inscription on a wall," the commander said. "Looks like the school used to be a military outpost. Maybe coincidence, maybe not." Emily closed her fingers around the tag. "He always said I'd find him again," she murmured. "Didn't think it'd be like this." The commander placed a hand on her shoulder. He'd have been proud. "I hope so," she said softly. "I finally did what he asked." "If no one else steps up," he began. She finished the sentence for him. "You do." Later that night she returned to her quarters. The cot creaked as she sat. The tag lay on her palm, cool against her skin. She set it beside the photograph on the metal table. Two relics from two different lives, the one she lived and the one she lost. In the reflection of the small mirror above her bunk, she looked older, not worn, just settled, the kind of face that carried its battles quietly. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of rotor blades, memory or reality, she couldn't tell. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest. But even in sleep, her mind didn't stop flying. In dreams, she was back in the sky, the hum of engines beneath her hands, the world falling away below. But this time there was no fire, no fear, no chaos, just silence, just peace. Jordan's voice came faint through the static of memory. "You did good, Raven." She smiled. And somewhere far away, under the quiet stars of Basra, a single helicopter sat under moonlight, scarred, silent, but ready. Waiting. Because the war never really ends. It just moves to quieter skies. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't flying into danger. It's walking away from the noise once it's done. And knowing you don't need anyone to tell you what you already know. That you were enough. Why did coming home feel harder than flying through fire? The flight back wasn't a victory lap, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed against your ribs and made you realize how heavy silence could be. The sky above the transport was a soft gray, the world below nothing but endless desert fatting into sea. Emily sat near the window, eyes unfocused, watching clouds drift past. Her hands rested on her lap, the dog tag still wrapped around her wrist. Jordan Price. The name caught the sunlight and burned like memory. Across the cabin, a few rescued hostages sat together, whispering, laughing weakly. Relief sounded strange after so much fear, brittle, unsure, like something that might crack if handled too hard. One little girl kept looking at Emily, maybe 7 or 8 years old. When their eyes met, the girl smiled shyly and raised her hand, a small wave of gratitude. Emily nodded back, lips twitching into a soft smile. Then she looked away. Because that wave carried a weight she didn't know how to hold. When the transport landed at the military airfield, cameras were waiting. Reporters lights applause. It was like stepping into another world, one she didn't belong to. Flashbulbs popped in her face, questions shouted from every angle. Captain Hayes, how did you do it? What was going through your mind? What does it feel like to be a hero? Hero? That word again. She kept walking, jaw tight, eyes forward. The air smelled of fuel and perfume, a strange mix of war and civility. She saluted the waiting general, accepted his handshake, and stood still while someone snapped a picture. Every click of the camera felt like a theft, as if they were taking pieces of something sacred and turning it into decoration. When they asked her to give a statement, she spoke in the same calm tone she always used. It was a team effort, she said. Every life saved belongs to those who were there, the SEALs, the crew chiefs, the medics. I just flew. The general smiled for the microphones. That humility is what makes our heroes great, he said, voice booming for the cameras. She hated that word more each time it echoed. Because heroism to her wasn't standing under bright lights. It was kneeling in the dirt beside a dying soldier and stopping the bleeding. It was flying through gunfire because no one else would. It was the silence between choices, the part no one ever saw. And yet now, they wanted to make her a symbol. 2 days later, she was home. Portsmouth, Virginia, small docks, quiet streets, the scent of salt water clinging to everything. The kind of town that never really changed. Her mother met her at the airport, eyes bright with pride and relief. You look thinner, she said, hugging her tight. I always do after missions, Emily murmured, smiling softly. Her mother's hands lingered on her face, studying her the way mothers do, searching for damage that uniforms can't show. I saw you on the news, she said. You looked so calm. Everyone's talking about you. Let them talk, Emily said quietly. They weren't there. That night she slept in her old room. The posters were gone, the furniture rearranged, but the window still faced the docks. The same moonlight spilled across the same wooden floor. She sat awake long after midnight, listening to the faint hum of ship engines in the distance. Her uniform hung on the back of the chair. The medal they'd pinned on her chest earlier sat beside it, polished, heavy, meaningless. She picked it up once, turned it in her hand, then set it back down. It wasn't guilt she felt. It was something deeper, a kind of hollowness that came when the world insisted you were whole while you knew you were. 3 days later, command called. Public Affairs is requesting an interview, her co said. They want to run a feature, maybe even a documentary. No, she said simply. There was a pause on the line. Captain, this isn't really optional. You're the face of the mission now. People want to see you. I didn't do it to be seen. I know, but it's good for the service, good for morale. Morale doesn't need my face, she said. It needs truth, and the truth doesn't fit into headlines. Emily. Captain Hayes, she corrected softly. The silence stretched before the officer sighed. I'll tell them you declined, for now. Thank you. When the call ended, she sat at her kitchen table, the dog tag still wrapped around her wrist. She turned it slowly between her fingers. Jordan would have laughed at all this. He'd have told her to take the interview, smile for the camera, play the game. People need stories, he used to say, even if they never understand them. Maybe he was right, but she couldn't do it, not yet, maybe not ever. The days turned to weeks. The world moved on. News cycles faded, attention shifted to newer crises, fresher tragedies, but not for her. She spent her mornings at the airfield, helping the local training crews, flying cargo drops, sometimes taking cadets on their first rides. The air was simpler there, no politics, no press, no ghosts. Still, every time her hands wrapped around the controls, she felt that old tremor of memory, the vibration of rotors slicing through chaos, the voice of the SEAL commander crackling in her headset, the scream of RPGs overhead. And sometimes, when the light hit just right, she could almost see Jordan sitting in the co-pilot's seat again, smirking the way he used to. "You never were good at being invisible," he'd say. She'd smile to the empty seat. "Watch me." One afternoon, her commanding officer visited the hangar. He stood by the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, watching her inspect the tail rotor. "You planning to stay grounded forever?" he asked. "Just until I forget how to explain the parts that don't make sense," she said. He nodded slowly. "You know they're nomming a wing after you." She froze, wrench halfway to the panel. "They're what?" "It's been approved. The Hayes wing. Dedication ceremony next month." She exhaled sharply, setting the wrench down. "I don't want that." "It's already happening." Her voice hardened. "I didn't save those people alone. Don't turn their survival into my monument." He hesitated. "That's not how it works, Captain. People need names to remember. They need someone to represent what they believe in." "Then pick someone who wants it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You know, most people would kill for that kind of legacy." She met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "Most people don't understand the cost." That night she went for a walk along the docks. The tide was low, the air thick with salt and the faint hum of ship engines. Her father's old welding shop stood dark across the street, closed for the night, tools still lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. She stopped at the edge of the pier, leaning against the rail. The water below was dark, rippling faintly in the moonlight. She took the dog tag from her wrist, held it up between her fingers. The name caught the light again. "Jordan," she whispered, "they keep trying to turn what we did into something clean. But it wasn't clean, was it? It was chaos, it was fear, it was real." Her voice wavered for the first time in months. "I just hope you'd still recognize me now, because some days I barely do." She let the tag drop against her palm, closing her hand around it. "But I kept my promise," she said softly. "If no one else stepped up, I did." A gull cried somewhere in the dark. The waves slapped gently against the pier, and for a moment it almost felt like an answer. The next morning she received a letter, handwritten, creased, the ink slightly smudged. It was from one of the hostages. "Dear Captain Hayes, you don't know me, but I was one of the people in that school. I remember the sound of the helicopters. I remember thinking it was the end. But then we saw your face, calm, focused, not afraid. That's what I remember most. You weren't afraid. When I close my eyes, I still hear the rotors, but now that sound doesn't mean fear anymore. It means hope." She read the letter twice, then a third time. Hope. That word hurt more than hero ever could, because it meant something lived on, not her name, not her story, but the feeling she'd left behind. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside the dog tag in her pocket. That evening, as the sun fell over the harbor, she took her small seaplane out alone. The sky burned gold over the Atlantic and the air was calm. She didn't take a radio, didn't need one. Up there were no medals, no titles, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She flew low over the water, the world stretching endless and quiet beneath her. For the first time since Basra, she smiled, really smiled. Because the sky, at least, still made sense. Sometimes the world will call you a hero for surviving what broke you. But the truth is quieter. Sometimes survival isn't victory. It's just the courage to keep flying, even when no one understands where you're going. Why did the world only listen once she stopped speaking? 3 weeks had passed since Basra, but the noise hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. Every channel, every feed, every paper seemed to have her name plastered somewhere between the headlines and the hashtags. The Raven of Basra. That's what they called her now. A myth, a symbol, a story polished until it shone and until all the jagged edges were gone. The first time she saw one of the news reports, she turned the TV off halfway through. They'd edited footage from the mission, shaky drone shots mixed with triumphant music, and a voiceover calling her a fearless heroine who defied orders to save lives. Fearless. She hated that word most of all. Because she had been afraid, terrified every second of that flight. That's what courage was, flying anyway. Now strangers told her what she'd felt, what she'd meant, who she was. And somehow the more they spoke, the less she recognized herself in their stories. The military brass had embraced it, of course. It was good for morale, good for recruitment, good for headlines. There were ceremonies, dinners, and interviews she refused until refusal itself became a story. Captain Hayes declines to comment. She'd become a ghost the media couldn't catch, and that only made them chase harder. It was strange. For years, no one had listened to her. Then suddenly, the world couldn't stop listening, but they only wanted her voice if it fit their script. So she stayed quiet. The ceremony for the dedication of the Hayes wing came anyway. She couldn't avoid it, command had insisted. So she went. The hangar was filled with uniforms and polished speeches. A new sign hung over the flight bay doors, the Hayes wing, in honor of courage beyond command. She stood at the back of the crowd, sunglasses hiding her eyes, hands behind her back. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and freshly printed programs. A general she'd never met took the podium. His voice echoed through the hangar, practiced and warm. Captain Emily Hayes represents the very best of what we stand for: discipline, courage, sacrifice. Applause followed, loud and sharp. Cameras flashed. Emily kept her face still. The general continued. Her actions in Basra have inspired a generation. Let this wing serve as a reminder that even in the darkest hours, heroes rise. More applause. The word hero echoed again. She wished just once they'd stop saying it like a brand. When they called her to the front, she walked slowly, steady, eyes fixed ahead. A colonel pinned a new insignia to her chest, smiled for the cameras, whispered, "Smile, Captain, they're watching." She didn't. She just saluted, turned, and walked back down the line. That night she sat alone in the empty hangar. The lights were off, except for the moonlight spilling through the high windows. Her helicopter, the same one from Basra, rested in the shadows, half repaired, its scars still visible along the tail. She ran her hand along the metal, fingers tracing the patchwork where shrapnel had torn through. It was rough under her touch, imperfect, honest. "This is what courage looks like," she whispered to the silence. "Not medals, not wings, scars." Her voice cracked on the last word. She stood there for a long time, the sound of her own breathing echoing in the still air. In the days that followed, she started spending time at the flight academy nearby, unofficially at first. Young pilots gathered there, all nerves and ambition, still thinking war was something that happened far away, in stories told by people like her. At first they didn't recognize her. She wore plain clothes, hair tied back, no rank insignia. She just sat quietly in the corner of the hangar, listening as instructors barked through training routines. Then one afternoon, a cadet's engine cut mid-lift. The helicopter bucked, nose dipping toward the ground. The instructor shouted for emergency shutdown, but Emily was already moving. She reached the cockpit in seconds, hands slamming the cutoff lever, voice calm and firm. "Hold the cyclic steady. Breathe, don't fight it." The bird settled with a heavy thump, the rotor blades slowing. The cadet, barely 20, face pale with fear, stared up at her. "What did I do wrong?" he stammered. Emily gave a small smile. "You panicked." He blinked. "That's it." "That's everything," she said. "Machines don't fail because they want to. They fail because people forget they can." The instructor recognized her then, his expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. "Captain Hayes." She nodded once, "Just Emily today." From that moment on, she wasn't invisible anymore. Word spread quickly through the academy. The quiet woman who showed up at the hangar wasn't just anyone. She was her. Soon cadets started seeking her out for advice, for stories, for something they couldn't name. She didn't lecture. She didn't talk about glory or victory. She talked about mistakes, fear, and what it meant to keep flying when everything inside you wanted to stop. Once a young woman asked, "Ma'am, were you scared that day?" Emily paused, then said softly every second, "Then how did you do it?" I stopped asking if I could, started asking what would happen if I didn't. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks in deep. Weeks turned into months, the fame faded at last, the headlines found new names to celebrate. And for the first time in years, Emily felt invisible again. It was a relief. She found herself laughing with the cadets, sometimes small laughs, quick but real. She helped them clean the rotors, checked their logbooks, taught them how to listen to the sound of an engine instead of just reading the dials. "Machines talk," she told them once, leaning against a fuselage. "You just have to care enough to hear them." They listened. One afternoon, as she walked the line inspecting aircraft, she noticed a young cadet staring at her arm, the one with the tattoo. "Wings and an anchor," he said quietly. "What does it mean?" She smiled faintly. "It means someone once taught me how to fly and never got the chance to come home." The boy hesitated. "Was he your teacher?" "He was my friend," she said softly. "The kind who reminds you that courage doesn't always survive. Sometimes it just passes on." The cadet nodded, unsure what to say. She didn't need him to say anything. That night she sat outside the hangar on a bench, watching the sky darken. The air smelled of oil and sea wind. Somewhere in the distance, a plane climbed into the clouds, its lights blinking faintly against the dark. She pulled the dog tag from her pocket, turning it slowly between her fingers. "Still flying, Jordan," she murmured, "just not as far." The wind carried the whisper away. She smiled to herself, a small, content kind of smile, the kind that came when you realized you didn't need the world to understand you anymore. A week later, her commanding officer stopped by again. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Word is you've been teaching half the academy on your own time," he said. "I like seeing them learn," she replied. He chuckled. "You always did prefer the hangar to the spotlight." "Spotlights burn too hot," she said. He nodded. "You know there's talk upstairs about giving you a training command, your own program." She blinked. "Mine." "Yours," he confirmed. "No politics, just pilots. You'd shape the next generation." For the first time in months, she hesitated, not from fear, from thought. She looked out at the flight line, where the cadets were laughing near the fuel trucks, sunlight flashing off their helmets. "I'll think about it," she said finally. He smiled. "That's all I ask." That evening, after the base went quiet, she walked down to the water again. The reflection of the runway lights shimmered on the surface. She sat on the dock's edge, boots dangling above the waves, and breathed. Somewhere behind her, the faint sound of engines hummed, cadets finishing late drills. She closed her eyes and let the sound wrap around her like memory. Jordan's voice echoed faintly again. "You never stopped flying, did you?" "Didn't know how," she whispered. "Sometimes redemption doesn't come in medals or ceremonies. Sometimes it comes in teaching someone else how to keep their wings steady when the world tilts beneath them. Because legacy isn't about names on walls. It's about what still flies after you're gone." Why did the past always find a way to circle back? The hangar buzzed with life again, but this time it was hers. Her squadron, her pilots. The newly formed Raven program wasn't flashy. It didn't have the funding of major commands or the attention of the brass. It was built from borrowed hangar space, recycled simulators, and a team of young flyers who didn't quite fit anywhere else. Emily had handpicked every one of them, the quiet ones, the ones who listened more than they spoke, the ones who didn't need to be the loudest in the room to matter. They reminded her of herself, before the medals, before the myths, before Basra. Her mornings began at dawn, clipboard in hand, watching the cadets prep their aircraft. Her voice carried across the tarmac, steady, even, confident. Check hydraulics twice. You only get to be wrong once. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her silence carried weight now, earned, not demanded. When her cadets looked at her, they didn't see the hero from the news reels. They saw their teacher, someone who understood the space between fear and flight. On the third week of training, a young pilot named Ortiz clipped a rotor during a hover exercise. The bird jolted, spinning halfway before settling down. The cadet froze in the cockpit, trembling, ashamed. Emily climbed up the side of the helicopter, opened the door, and crouched beside him. "You alive?" He nodded, breathing fast. "Ma'am, I messed up. I could have crashed." "You didn't." "But I almost." She cut him off gently. "Almost is the word between quitting and learning. You only fail if you stop flying." He stared at her, unsure if she was angry. She was. She smiled faintly. "Next time when you feel the spin coming, don't fight it. Flow with it until you can correct it. You panic, you overcorrect, you die. Calm saves lives, even your own." He nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Later that day, she found him in the mess hall studying diagrams of flight dynamics. He looked up as she passed. "Thank you, ma'am." "For what?" "For not yelling." She shrugged. "Yelling doesn't teach people how to listen." Weeks turned into months. The Raven program grew stronger. They weren't the best by textbook standards, but they were disciplined, adaptable, calm. The kind of pilots you could trust when everything else went wrong. And that trust was about to be tested. It started with a storm. A real one, not metaphorical, not poetic. A hurricane sweeping up the eastern seaboard. Winds strong enough to ground civilian flights and scramble every emergency unit in the state. The academy had shut down early, evacuating personnel inland. But a Coast Guard distress call came through at midnight. A convoy of supply ships trapped off the coast, taking on water. Communication down. Emily wasn't on duty anymore. Her cadets weren't supposed to fly in weather like that. But when she saw the report, something cold and familiar twisted in her gut. The map showed a storm cell stretching over the Atlantic. The ship's last known position blinked red on the radar, lost in the dark. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she picked up her headset. When she entered the hangar, the rain was hammering the roof like artillery fire. Lightning flashed beyond the runway, painting the clouds silver white. Her cadets were already there, Ortiz, Liu, Harper, all waiting. "You're not serious," Ortiz said, voice almost lost in the wind. She pulled on her gloves, voice steady. "They need us." "Ma'am, those winds are 30 knots cross current. We'll never hold stable hover." "Then we'll adapt." Command didn't authorize. "Command didn't authorize Basra either," she said quietly. That silenced him. They looked at her young faces, half afraid, half inspired. She met their eyes. "This isn't a mission, it's a choice. I'm not ordering anyone, but I won't stand by while people drown within reach of our rotors." The wind howled through the open hangar doors. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ortiz grabbed his helmet. "You're going, I'm going." Liu nodded, "Same." Harper grinned faintly. "Guess the Raven program just went live." Emily smiled just slightly. "Let's fly." The storm was worse than any of them had expected. Sheets of rain hammered the windshield, visibility dropping to near zero. Lightning cracked across the sky like a strobe light. Her voice cut through the comms, calm and precise. "Raven 1 to all birds. Keep altitude under 300 feet. Stay close to the coastline until visual." "Copy that, Raven 1, Ortiz replied, his voice tight but controlled. Wind buffeted the aircraft, slamming them sideways. The cadets struggled to correct, hands white-knuckled on the controls. Emily guided them through it, every turn, every gust, her instructions steady as a heartbeat. Ease your cyclic, trust the lift, don't fight the wind, use it. It was chaos, but under her command it became rhythm. 30 miles out, the radar pinged faint signals from two ships drifting in the storm. One was listing heavily, lights flickering through the sheets of rain. Visual on target, Liu reported. Starboard sides breached. Ortiz, bring your bird up on her bow, Emily ordered. Harper, hold position high for medevac. The first hoist went rough. The wind tore at the lines, the sea pitching beneath them like a living thing. But one by one, figures rose out of the dark, soaked, trembling, clinging to harnesses. Raven 2, cargo secure, Ortiz said breathlessly. Copy, Emily replied. Get them to the shoreline, I'll cover the second ship. She swung her bird toward the second vessel, heart pounding steady but fast. The ship below was nearly capsized, half submerged. Men clung to railings, screaming into the storm. Her crew chief leaned forward. Ma'am, if we hover lower, we risk tail strike. We don't hover lower, she said. We descend with them. She dropped the helicopter lower, matching the ship's tilt, rotor wash slicing through rain and foam. The waves surged against the hull, exploding upward. The smell of salt and diesel filled the cockpit. Steady, she whispered. Hold it steady. The crew chief shouted over the roar. Got them, winch engaged. The cable whined as two sailors rose from the dark, soaked and shivering. One slipped halfway, the line jerking hard, and Emily reacted instantly, tilting the bird just enough to counterweight the swing. The rotor screamed, metal straining. But it held. Seconds later, the two men were hauled into the cabin, coughing, eyes wide. Raven 1, last ship secure, her crew chief yelled. She exhaled slowly. All birds returned to base. By the time they landed, dawn was breaking through the rain. The hangar lights glowed through the mist, halos of pale yellow in the gray. Ground crews rushed forward, hauling survivors from the cabins. The rescued sailors clung to her cadets, weeping with exhaustion. Emily shut down her engine, removed her helmet, and sat for a long moment in the cockpit, breathing. Her reflection stared back at her in the cracked glass, older, lined but alive. She stepped down onto the wet tarmac. The cadets were waiting, soaked to the bone, uniforms plastered to their skin. Ortiz was grinning like a kid. We actually did it, he said, disbelief in his voice. We flew through a hurricane. Emily smiled faintly. You didn't fly through it, you flew with it. Liu wiped rain from her face. Command's going to lose their minds. Probably, Emily said. Harper laughed. Then it's official, the Raven program's cursed with your reputation. She raised an eyebrow. I can live with that. Later that morning, Command did call. The base commander's voice was a mix of fury and awe. You disobeyed a weather grounding order, Captain Hayes. You risked 3 aircraft and 12 personnel. Yes, sir. He hesitated. You also saved 24 lives, again. Emily said nothing. Next time, he said quietly, you clear it with me first. Understood. Hayes, don't make me regret letting you build that program. She smiled faintly. You won't, sir, but you might lose some sleep. He sighed. I already do. That night the cadets gathered in the hangar, exhausted but elated. Someone brought coffee. Someone else found a small speaker and played music, low, calm, almost reverent. Emily stood at the edge watching them, her pilots, her legacy. Ortiz noticed her and called out, Speech, ma'am. She shook her head. No speeches. Come on, Liu said. You always say something after a flight. Emily hesitated, then stepped forward, hands clasped loosely behind her back. You all did something today most people never will, she said quietly. You trusted each other. You didn't panic. You didn't wait for orders. You acted because someone needed you. She paused, looking around at their faces, young, alive, carrying the glow of purpose. Never lose that. The world will try to tell you when to act, when to stay still, what's safe, what's not. But when lives hang in the balance, when silence fills the room, be the one who steps forward. Her voice softened. If no one else does, you do. A hush fell over the hangar. Then Ortiz raised his cup. To Raven. To Raven, the others echoed. When the lights dimmed and the cadets left, Emily stayed behind. The hangar was quiet again, her helicopter gleaming faintly under the lamps. She ran her hand along its side, one last time that night. Jordan's dog tag hung from her wrist, catching the faint glow. "You were right," she whispered. "You don't stop flying, you just find new skis." Sometimes history repeats itself, not to test your strength, but to remind you who you became the first time you refused to look away. Why does it always end with the sound of rotors fatting into the distance? The storm had passed, but the airfield still carried its scent: wet asphalt, oil, salt. The hangar doors stood open, morning light spilling across the tarmac. Emily stood there, coffee in hand, watching her cadets go through maintenance checks. The Raven program was no longer just a patch on a flight suit. It was alive, breathing, real. And it didn't need her anymore. She realized that the moment she saw Ortiz giving orders, calm, clear, confident, the same tone she used to use. Liu was guiding 2 new recruits through emergency startup drills. Harper was teaching line checks like he'd been born to do it. They were all flying now, not because she told them how, but because she taught them why. And that was enough. Later that morning, she sat in the commander's office, a sealed envelope in front of her. Her resignation letter. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying her with tired eyes. "You sure about this, Hayes? You're the reason this program even exists." "I'm sure," she said quietly. "They don't need me hovering over them anymore. They need to lead." He nodded slowly. "You've built something good here." "I didn't build it," she said. "I just reminded them what it means to care about the sky." He smiled faintly. "You always had a poetic way of saying goodbye." "I'm not saying goodbye," she said, standing. "I'm just landing somewhere else." He extended his hand. "For what it's worth, Captain Hayes, I'll miss your kind of trouble." She shook it firmly. "Then you'll miss the quiet." She packed light one duffel, her flight jacket, a small framed photo of her original crew, and a worn dog tag that never left her wrist. As she walked out of the hangar, the cadets spotted her and ran up, still in flight suits, smelling like jet fuel and determination. "Ma'am, you're leaving?" Liu asked, her voice cracking slightly. Emily smiled softly. "Just moving on, you've got the skis covered." Ortiz stepped forward. "You're not really quitting, are you?" "I'm not quitting," she said. "I'm trusting." They fell silent. Harper finally said, "Where will you go?" "Somewhere quieter," she said. "Maybe somewhere no one needs saving for a while." Liu hesitated. "What if we need you?" Emily's eyes softened. "Then fly how I taught you, steady, calm, and only afraid of not trying." A lump formed in Ortiz's throat. He straightened his shoulders. "Permission to walk you out, ma'am." She nodded. They walked the line together, down the runway where the sun was just starting to break through the last of the storm clouds. At the end, she turned to them all. "Remember this," she said quietly. "You don't fly to escape the ground, you fly to carry it with you." Then she saluted, not out of formality but respect, and they returned it, every one of them. That evening she drove to the coast, the same dock where she used to sit after Basra. The sea was calm now, stretching endlessly under a fatting gold sky. She stood at the edge, the waves whispering at her boots, and held the dog tag between her fingers. Jordan's name was almost worn smooth from years of touch. She smiled faintly. "I finally figured it out," she said. "It's not about flying away, it's about knowing when to land." She pulled out the letter from one of the rescued hostages, the one that had once broken her silence, and read it again. When I close my eyes, I still hear the rotors, but now that sound doesn't mean fear anymore. It means hope. Hoping. That was the word she'd been afraid of, because hope required you to believe that what you did mattered, even if no one remembered your name. She folded the letter carefully, slid it back into her jacket, and looked up at the horizon. A faint rumble echoed overhead, a helicopter passing far out to sea. Its lights blinked against the clouds. She watched it until it disappeared. Weeks later, word spread quietly that Captain Emily Hayes had retired from active duty. No ceremony, no speeches, just a file closed, a locker emptied, and a name that would live on in stories whispered among pilots. The Raven program kept flying. They painted her call sign, Raven 1, on the side of their hangar door, not as worship, as memory. And sometimes, when the cadets practiced late, they swore they could hear another rotor blending in the wind, faint, distant, like someone still watching over them. But Emily wasn't gone. She'd moved inland to a small airfield in the mountains, the kind of place where the clouds touched the peaks and mornings smelled of pine and jet fuel. She flew medical supply runs now, small hops between remote hospitals and rescue posts. No press, no medals, no eyes watching. Just sky. And that was enough. One morning, while refueling her plane, a young medic approached her. "You're Captain Hayes, aren't you? From the Raven Wing." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Now I'm just Emily." He grinned. "My sister was one of the people rescued in that hurricane. She told me how your squadron came for them, said you never flinched." Emily looked down for a moment, hand tightening on the fuel line. "Everyone flinches," she said softly. "Courage is just what happens next." The medic nodded slowly, realizing she meant it. That night the mountain air was cool, the stars clear. Emily sat on the wing of her plane, legs swinging gently, looking out over the valley. She thought about all the sounds that had defined her life: rotor blades, gunfire, radio chatter, and the whisper of wind through hangars. And beneath all of it, something constant: the quiet rhythm of a heartbeat that refused to stop, even when everything else did. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the dog tag one last time. It glinted faintly in the starlight. She smiled, "Still with me, partner." Then she hung it on the rearview mirror inside the cockpit, where it would catch the sun every dawn. The next morning, she took off just as the first light hit the peaks. The propeller spun into a blur, the mountains slowly falling away beneath her. The radio crackled faintly. "Raven 1, you still out there?" She smiled at the static. "Always." Sometimes the world remembers heroes for what they did. But the real measure is quieter, found in those who carry the lesson forward. The ones who fly steady when storms return. The ones who act without waiting for permission. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.